ตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings to you all. Tonight is the lunar observance night, the Buddhist holy day. It's the 8th day of the lunar cycle. So 8 days ago was the full moon, the new moon, and this is half moon, and then next week will be the full moon. So it's a very good occasion, suitable occasion to come together to practice meditation, hear the Dhamma. This is something Buddhists have been doing for over 2,500 years, since the time of the Buddha. When the Buddha started teaching, one of the monks pointed out that other religious sects would come together on these days, like 4 times a month, to meet, practice together. And the Buddha gave permission for the monks and laity to come together in a similar way, as a way to for the lay people to set aside their normal concerns about work and family and other activities. And even the Sangha, sometimes Sangha, we get caught up in other activities such as teaching or building or running monasteries. So it's a good time when people come together for the Dhamma. Earlier this evening we chanted the Parittas, which is something we do regularly on the observance days. Again, it's something that links us right back to the time of the Buddha. The Parittas are verses of protection, suttas, teachings, verses. Many of them, most of them are said to be the word of the Buddha. And as you probably know, when the Buddha first began teaching, the only way his teachings were passed around was monks would remember them word by word, and then having committed them to memory, they could transmit them to others by reciting them. And so after the Buddha passed away for the first couple of 100 years, that's how the Buddhist teachings were preserved until they were written down. So we have this tradition of both Sangha and laity learning Pali words, the suttas, the teachings, and these verses of protection, the Parittas. Of course, the Pali language is no longer in use. It's related to some of the Indian dialects, it's related to Sanskrit, but the Pali language as we chant is no longer spoken, but it's preserved and has been preserved by Buddhists committing the suttas, the Vinaya, the Abhidhamma to memory, as well as writing them down. And actually this memorization of verses of protection, the Parittas, is a very good mental training. And it's no different from other kinds of meditation. It's a form of meditation or bhavana. And perhaps you should look on it like that. Particularly in the West, if we are in a non-Buddhist surrounded by a non-Buddhist culture, then chanting can seem strange. We're unfamiliar with it, maybe uncomfortable at first trying it. But if you can see that what you're doing when you're learning or memorizing chants and then actually reciting them, you're training your mind in a way just as if you're practicing meditation such as mindfulness of breathing or even vipassana meditation, you're focusing on impermanence, for example. So when you're chanting something, even if only briefly, your mind has to focus on those words, just as when you're practicing mindfulness of breathing, you pay attention to the breath. When you're chanting, you're reciting, you're paying attention to those Pali words. And particularly when I was a young monk, I always found that quite a good practice to do, because if you're learning a chant or actually chanting something that you've learned, if you are distracted, you're not mindful, well, obviously the word doesn't come out of your mouth at that moment. If you start thinking about something else, you stop chanting. And you see very quickly, or you become aware very quickly that you're not mindful because the sound stops. Probably that's best of all when you're on your own, if you're chanting on your own. But even if you're chanting together with other people, you notice when you're not mindful. And probably most people who've tried chanting, they'll be aware of some days when you have a strong attachment, some emotion has come up. There's a kind of struggle in your mind, in your mental space, between the activity of chanting and memorizing and chanting the words, and then another emotion has come up and you want to think about something else. Maybe it's a very strong feeling, mental images, thoughts coming up. There's a kind of battle to see who can win. Sometimes the emotions are quite positive because chanting itself will bring up joy, sense of peace, calm, can reinforce your faith. So this quality, saddha, faith, confidence in the Buddha, can arise. With that you often get these qualities we call piti and pamoja, like rapture and joy coming up. And occasionally even people go into states of samadhi, probably what we call upajjhara samadhi, when you're still, your mind is not completely one-pointed as in state of jhana, but where the five hindrances fade away and the factors of samadhi come up. Body and mind feel very light, rapturous as you're chanting. This is quite common. Just like when we listen to the Dhamma, listening to a Dhamma talk can also do the same thing. So even if you're not familiar with chanting, it's something to maybe try out or investigate. And maybe many people find that it's a very good link between our daily life, the mind that's always thinking and planning and getting caught up into stress and worries, and the practice of meditation. And so many people will begin their meditation by doing a short or longer chant to settle their mind. Because if you've been out or doing different activities and then you sit down with the aim of meditating on the breath, that's quite a challenge, because the breath is a very refined object. It's very subtle. On the best of occasions you might find it quite hard to stay with the breath or find the breath, stay with it and be mindful of it. But if you've previously been very busy, rushing around doing activities, working or shopping or cleaning or looking at your phone or something, chanting can be a very good way to bring your mind to the Dhamma, bring up mindfulness from moment to moment, prior to developing other forms of meditation, such as mindfulness of breathing or vipassana meditation. And many people use it successfully in that way. So they have a regular chanting practice, just like we do in the monasteries. Monasteries and temples will tend to be places where people do chanting regularly. And you can do that at home as well. So particularly the parittas are good chants because the meaning is so powerful. People often find that they are very meditative, and by chanting the parittas, or occasionally even just listening to other people chant, your mind goes very still and quiet, and this sense of joy, relaxation comes up, and it helps you to let go of distracting states of mind. It helps to brighten the mind, so it can help you to let go of sleepiness, and so on. Also, it's particularly used for anxiety, worry, anxiety, nerves, and I regularly remind people to use chanting in this way, whether it's just a simple chant like Iti Piso Bhagava Arahang, chanting in praise of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, or any of the other parittas, longer parittas like the Mangala Sutta, the Ratana Sutta, and so on. It's a very good practice when you're feeling nervous, worried, afraid, and you find it quite hard to meditate on something like the breath or any other form of meditation you find difficult. Chanting may be the best option in those situations. And Buddhists over the centuries have done this, at times when they've got nothing else to cling to, but they want to cling to something wholesome and good, then they cling to their chanting. You might call it a skillful form of attachment. Like quite often, we hear about, in Buddhism, we're teaching everyone to let go of attachment. And basically we are, but there are ways of letting go. And sometimes before you can let go of attachment, you have to cling on to the good things first as a way of training your mind. You cling on to the good in order to let go of the negative. So say you're fearful or anxious, then you cling on to the chanting as a way to let go of the fear or the anxiety. As I mentioned just now, say you're chanting, say you are afraid of something, you're about to have surgery, or you have some health problem, or you have to go into some situation that makes you feel anxious, uncomfortable, meet a person that you don't get on with, or go for a job interview or something. Chanting is a way to steady the mind and bring up the mindfulness when maybe everything else fails. And you may have to work at it. You have the worries, the anxiety, so your mind wants to go to that, to think, to imagine about whatever it is that you're afraid of. So you have to work with bringing the mind to the chanting and recite that chanting until your mind lets go of the anxiety. As I said, we can do it. I've done that before. Many other people I know have done that successfully, and not only once, but many times. So Buddhist monks use this technique when they're alone in the forest. They've got nothing else to cling to. You have a term like when you go into the forest or a lonely place, remote place, lonely place, and fear comes up. In Thai they have a phrase, they say, "Chit tak," which means your mind is broken. Maybe only temporarily, but your mind is broken, meaning you can't concentrate, you can't settle down. You're thinking, you're worrying too much. So what do you do in a situation like that? So if you're in the forest and you hear the sound of wild animals around, or even just have the thought that they may be around, your mind just can't settle down. You can't sleep, you can't think of much other than what you're afraid of. Or say you're somebody who has strong belief in ghosts, spirits, and you're in a place that you think might be haunted. Again, that's probably all you can think of at that time. Or if you've got the news that you've got a severe illness, such as cancer or heart disease, and the fear comes up so strongly, there's really nothing else you can think of. This is what we mean like the mind breaking. You can't function normally, you can't think normally, concentrate in the normal way. So that's a time where paritta chanting can really help. Psychologically, it's bringing up very positive emotions, calming you down, concentrating the mind, reminding you of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and the teachings. Brings up faith, patience, energy, mindfulness, and so on. Of course, you have to work at it, but if you've done it before successfully, then you can do it again. And particularly monks, but not just monks, anyone who goes into the forest or camping, they may well have those moments when they're feeling nervous or uncomfortable. That's the time where you can really put it to the test, and you rely on, or you cling to, as it were, your paritta chanting. And you can chant the same chant many times if you want. There's no limit to this. It's not like you just chant once and that's it, finish. Even though sometimes that's what we want. We want a quick fix for everything these days. Sometimes you just chant something, the same thing over and over again, or a number of different verses you chant in succession. And maybe you just keep chanting until the mind quietens down. And particularly the monks will know this. You go to somewhere, if you ever have fear of animals, ghosts, concerns about something or other, you chant until you've subdued your anxiety or your fear. And this is how the Buddha himself said he practiced. He said he would stay in the posture that when fear arose, he would either carry on walking if he was walking, he'd carry on sitting if he was sitting, and he would complete his meditation by practicing until he had subdued his mind and let go of that particular fear, anxiety. And it can work for greed, lust, anger as well. All the different mental defilements can be subdued by chanting. But the idea is to continue the chanting until that particular troublesome mental state has passed, subsided. And that's like you've glued your mind back together again. It's no longer broken, it's now mended, repaired by the chanting. And this is something you can learn, and you can use it, whether it's as a forerunner to other meditations such as mindfulness of breathing, or you're using it as a whole practice meditation in itself. It can be either way. Sometimes we get strength when we do it together as well with other people. So I often talk about times, being on the aeroplane flying through the Himalayas when there was the upsurge of turbulence and the whole plane was being knocked about and all the baggage was falling out of the baggage compartments and nobody could do anything other than cling to their seat. So then the monks started chanting Iti Piso Bhagava Arahang, and then got the whole plane chanting. Which is an amazing thing to think that you can get a commercial airline, the whole passenger roster on that airline chanting, including the crew as well. I'm sure it's happened other times as well, but it's quite a nice thing to know that even that's possible on a commercial airline when there's turbulence. And it works, it calms you down, brings your mind to the present moment, course, people assign a lot of superstition and to those kind of ways of thinking to things like chanting, and they say, well, if you chant, then all your troubles will be gone, and the world will be righted, and you'll recover from your illness, and the danger will be gone. Well, that may happen, but nobody's expecting that. If you're treating or viewing your chanting correctly, it's really a way of improving your state of mind. That's the number one benefit. That in itself is an amazing thing. If you are experiencing anxiety, depression, fear, and through chanting you bring up these more positive qualities, well, that is an amazing thing. You could say that's miraculous. Bringing your mind from an unwholesome state to a wholesome state. But people tend to go to extremes, so they're looking more externally and they say, well, I chanted and the tiger ran away, or I recovered from my illness overnight by chanting, and all these. They're looking for that kind of quick fix. And that may or may not happen, and the chanting may or may not be the cause. So don't be too build up too many expectations. But what you can prove and recognize or notice quite quickly is just the improvement in your state of mind when you're facing some difficulty. That much you can see, and that is in itself, that's the amazing thing. It can help you to bring up mindfulness where there was no mindfulness. It can help you to subdue your fear so that you feel more calm, more peaceful. It can help you to subdue your anger. If you're mindful enough to think of it, which doesn't always happen, does it? If you're angry, sometimes the anger is so strong, you're not going to think of chanting. But if you're ever in that position where you're just beset by your anger, your hatred, you're so unhappy, you're looking around for some way to improve it, well, that's the time to say, I should do my chanting now. Chant the parittas. Go away and leave the situation. If it's a situation where you're arguing with someone, you're angry with someone, or you're in some situation, some place, that's the time to go away and do some chanting. Chant the parittas. And just observe yourself. What happens if you're chanting a paritta? It's very difficult to maintain an angry state of mind if you're sincerely putting effort into chanting. If you're sincerely thinking of the Buddha, it's hard to get angry. If you're sincerely thinking of the Dhamma, the Sangha, it's hard to get angry. Or it's hard to keep anger, even if you started off with anger. It's the same with fear, it's the same with, could be some form of greed, jealousy, any of the strong negative emotions. It's very hard for them to stay in your mind if you're consciously turning your mind to something very wholesome, like chanting parittas. So this is a method people have used over the centuries, right up to this day and age. And it's not like in the modern day you don't need it anymore. It can be still very valuable. Everyone still gets old every day, and we're all facing sickness, and sometimes sickness comes on strong. Everyone from time to time might have an accident or some situation that just brings a lot of anxiety. So chanting is always available to you. Of course, many people don't like, or they don't feel connection to the more traditional aspects of the Buddhist religion, like chanting. They're too unfamiliar with it, or they see other people chanting and they see it as just some kind of ritual, maybe even look down on it, think of it as some kind of mumbo jumbo, and maybe they ask their friend, what are you chanting? And their friend can't really explain the words, because often we don't feel confident explaining the meaning of the words. So it is good to read the explanations, the translations as well. But what you have to see is that this is a very clear bit of psychology going on. It's not simple, empty ritual. It's training your mind in a very skillful way to bring up wholesome states of mind. Of course, some people look at chanting as kind of prayer, where you're asking for things, and they focus more on the asking, the wishing. I want this, I want that. It's understandable, but it does take over, so beware of that danger. It really is more about training the mind to let go of unwholesome states and cultivate wholesome states, what we call right effort, samma vayama, in the path. You have to see, another part of the Buddhist path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is what we call samma sankappa, often translated as right thought or correct thought. And chanting is right thought, isn't it? If you're focusing on a particular chant, say Itipiso Bhagava, reflecting on the qualities of the Buddha, who the Buddha was, the qualities of the Buddha, this is a very skillful way of thinking. And right thought is developed to counter wrong thought. Kind of logical. Wrong thought, the Buddha described as thoughts rooted in greed. So greed, lust, sensuality, all the forms of kind of obsessive desire based on our six senses. So greed for sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and all the fantasies and the imagining that we have. Also, thought rooted in ill will, aversion, mild irritation up to full-blown rage and anger. And then thought rooted in hatred, actually wanting to get someone, get revenge on someone, get back at someone, hurt someone or something, could be against an animal. These are the forms of wrong thought. Right thought is the opposite. So Nekama Sankappa means your thought of renunciation, letting go, contentment, thoughts rooted in non-ill will, so the opposite of anger, so kindness, tolerance, thoughts rooted in non-hatred, so compassion, forgiveness. You just think when you focus on chanting, whatever the chant, it very much is also developing right thought at that moment. That's why greed, anger, delusion, fear can't stay in your mind when you're chanting. If you're chanting sincerely and you're doing it, putting effort into it, you're gradually driving out the wrong thought from the mind, the thought that leads to stress, suffering, and filling the mind with right thought, the thought that brings with it peace, happiness. So not only is it right effort, it's right thought. There's already two factors of the Buddhist path, the Eightfold Path, are being cultivated there. May even lead on to right view, because many of these chants, when you do learn the meaning of them, you reflect on the meaning, the translation, well, it's helping you to gain better understanding of what you're doing, and perhaps understanding about suffering and how to abandon suffering, understanding the Four Noble Truths. So right view is being cultivated as well. So even though it may seem like Buddhist ritual and you're not very familiar with it, that's understandable, don't underestimate it. The power of chanting, learning suttas, parittas, reciting them, remembering them, using them as a way to train your mind. Very powerful. And to be honest, it can even lead on to the practice of vipassana meditation, which we tend to associate with sitting cross-legged, experiencing sensations coming up through the body, and painful feelings and pleasant feelings and mental states arising, passing away. Well, if you become familiar with the practice of chanting mindfully, then you can practice vipassana during your chanting and after your chanting as well. Because as you're chanting, you tend to become more mindful of your body and mind as you're doing it. You're mindful of the words, but what are the words? Well, they're sound. You're mindful of those sounds that you're making, the mental states that lie behind the action, how your body is as you're chanting, how you feel physically, and all kinds of other aspects of your experience can all become the basis for vipassana meditation as you're chanting. It doesn't have to be anything separate. And of course, you can't practice vipassana meditation effectively unless you're mindful. And if the chanting helps you to bring up a state of mindful awareness, well, why not? Of course, you can use many other meditation techniques such as the breath and other reflective meditations as well, of course. But chanting is one that I would definitely recommend. If you're a regular meditator and you consider yourself Buddhist, then try it out and learn a few chants. Have them there at your fingertips for those moments when you're struggling in something. I have lots of stories of people who have used chanting when they are in those difficult moments, when they have the job interview and there's 50 other people lining up for the same job, and the person is nervous and thinking, I'm not going to get this job, but they do their chanting while they're standing in line waiting for that interview, and they go in and their mind becomes so composed, so peaceful, and it becomes so radiant, then they get the job. I've heard these stories. People have told me how it's worked for them. Or the man who was in the car that left the road and rolled down into the ditch by the side of the road. The ditch was full of water, so his car started to sink. And he's thrashing around inside his car trying to get the door or the window open, and at first he couldn't, and then finally he found a way to get the window open. But before he did that, he actually started chanting as his car was filling up with water. He was chanting Iti Piso, Bhagawa Arahang, and he said it composed his mind enough to carry on searching for a way to get the window open, and then he got out through the window and he got away and he survived. There are many of these kind of stories, or they could be very ordinary things. You're in your house and you see some bug or a mouse or a cockroach or something, a spider that frightens you or just annoys you, and you recite these words, paritas, whatever verse you find inspiring enough just to keep your mind steady at that moment when you encounter the critter, the baddie, the bad guy. Or it could be when you're encountering a person, a threatening situation, maybe when maybe somebody is being physically aggressive or verbally abusive. What do you do? Well, sometimes if you've got no other choice, maybe just quietly reciting paritas can help you at that moment. At the very least, it gives your mind something to focus on, doesn't it? If you're in a situation where you don't know what to do, you're not able to flee maybe, you can't get out of there, well, at the very least you can recite verses, chant something that holds your attention in the present moment. You're definitely not going to be aggressive if you're chanting in that way. And often that leads to a good outcome because other people can pick up on your lack of aggression so they don't feel threatened. Maybe they leave you alone. Or animals are the same. Regularly animals pick up on the sense of peace that comes when somebody is chanting. And so, maybe you do encounter an animal. It doesn't necessarily have to be a wild tiger in the forest. It could be just your neighbor's dog. And the dog is barking, but you chant to keep your mindfulness, keep your mind steady at that moment. And the dog realizes you're no threat and you're not interested in the dog because you're chanting. Maybe that's the end of the dog problem. It can happen, you can use it in all these multitudinal different ways to help you through a difficult situation. And what you're really doing is bringing up mindfulness, clarity, clear comprehension at a time when perhaps you're stressed. So of course anything that helps you do that is good. Could be using the breath. Similarly, you go into the breath, taking deep breaths, or just following the breath for a period of time to bring up the mindfulness, calm you down. You can use chanting in the same way that you meditate. And of course, you don't just use it at times when you're feeling stressed. It's also good to do it when you have times for celebration. So like, if it's your birthday, that's a really good time to chant. We often recommend chanting, say your birthday, you're 20, you're 30 years old, you're 40 years old, then chant Iti Piso in praise of the Buddha, recollecting the Buddha 30 times, 40 times, 50 times, whatever your age is, as a way of expressing gratitude, reverence, respect for the Buddha, recollecting the Buddha, a teacher. We can do it for others. We can chant for those who are sick or suffering. We can chant for them. We can chant for ourselves. Or even if you're so ill that you can't use your voice, and that sometimes happens, well, maybe you can play a recording of other people chanting. So, nowadays on YouTube you can get every chant you want. You may have a recording, or you put on the net, open up, and you listen to chanting. Even if you're too weak or too ill to chant, you can always listen to others. And this is something, that you can turn to at any time. And not, as I said, not just when you're ill or suffering. When you're feeling fine, you can do it as well. And perhaps that's a good thing to try out. When you're feeling bright, energetic, we'll do some chanting then. Maybe your samadhi will go deeper than usual on the day that you chant. It clears away the hindrances for you. So when you practice your mindfulness of breathing, you go straight into a state of samadhi. So, as I said, it's the same with listening to Dhamma. Sometimes you listen to Dhamma and that puts your mind straight into a very wholesome state, and the hindrances drop away and you're able to contemplate, following the teaching of the Dhamma, and just contemplate impermanence, the arising, ceasing of your experience, because your mind becomes calm and mindful. Many of the great enlightened teachers would chant, and sometimes chant for long periods. And, say as a junior monk, I like to go and listen to the senior monks when they're chanting, because often they chanted, sometimes they had very beautiful voices, sometimes not. Not everyone is a great chanter, not everyone's voice is good, but it's more the mood that comes with the chanting. So if you believe a monk is enlightened, arahant, and they're chanting verses of Paritas or any other of the chants, devotional chants, often the mood that they bring to that chant is a very special mood. The atmosphere that develops around them as they're chanting can be very powerful, can be very peaceful, very radiant. And they say, if somebody is chanting sincerely, chanting loudly, often the devas will come to listen. When the devas come, then there's a bright, powerful energy with the devas as well. So, many teachers, when they chant, other people like to come and be there because they just get that good, powerful feeling. Sometimes just having lots of monks chant together. So, like, I was recently in Italy where we had a temple opening ceremony, and you got people, monks coming from all over the world, literally all over the world, come together and were chanting Paritas. You think about it, it's an amazing thing. This is 2,500 years after the time of the Buddha. These are the words of the Buddha still being recited, and then when they are recited in unison by a group of monks who have actually come from the four corners of the globe, from different continents, who normally speak different languages, come from different backgrounds, different cultures, all chanting the same verses of Paritas. That in itself is quite an amazing thing. But then the very energy that's generated from that is also a very amazing thing, very powerful. One of the disciples of Luang Por Man, Luang Por Chok, he would quite often recite suttas and paritas in the evening, and he often would be doing it on his own in the forest. But monks would sneak up to sit near him because the energy was so good, because they said lots of devas would come to listen to him. Luang Por Chok was considered to be an arahant, and he would chant, and they say the devas would come and listen out of respect. And other monks would come and sit there, and they say, oh, the energy was so good. It's like the whole forest would be filled with joy, as if somebody had turned a light on in the forest. Of course, the forest is dark at night, but it's as if the forest would become bright with the energy of the chanting and the devas and Luang Por Chok himself. And it's a very common experience. Monks who are well practiced, they develop a certain energy when they chant, and other people can witness that and feel that, and it's inspiring, and it makes you want to learn the chanting, and it kind of pulls you along. The faith comes up, and one of the ways faith affects us is it brings us energy and inspires us to want to practice more. And so when those monks would chant, that people would find that happen. They wanted to practice more. They would be willing to sit meditation longer. They'd be willing to let go of some of their anxiety, their stress, their greed, anger, delusion, just hearing the chanting from a good monk. I often quote that story when my brother was on his honeymoon. He came to Thailand, and I took him around to see some of the teachers, and we went to see a monk called Luang Por Somchai, who lived not far from Wat Marp Jan, where I used to live with Luang Por Anand. Luang Por Somchai lived in a forest on a mountain on the coast of Thailand in Jantaburi, and he built a big monastery and many students and disciples living there. And we went to see him, and he was already quite old and fairly sick, but he was a very compassionate monk, so he'd chant quite long blessings for people sometimes. So when I talked to him and told him that my brother had just got married, out of compassion he chanted a very long blessing which included some paritas for my brother. And my brother doesn't meditate and didn't have much, wasn't familiar with Buddhism, but he said he could feel the very warm, peaceful energy emanating from Luang Por Somchai. And Luang Por Somchai said he used chanting all the time as a way to focus the mind, prepare it for deeper states of meditation. And sometimes monks would go to him and they say, why do we chant so long? Because he would lead them chanting for long periods of time. And he said, well, what's the problem? Chanting is a very wholesome thing. You chant, what can you complain about? You're not harming anyone, you're not doing anything, you're not caught up in greed, anger and delusion when you're chanting. You're only doing a wholesome thing. So he used it quite often. So there are many aspects to our practice which are all fulfilling this, the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path can be developed from doing many things. Just listening to a blessing or chanting a parita yourself, as well as meditating, as well as listening to the Dhamma. All these activities have a certain way of purifying our mind, helping us to let go of greed, anger and delusion, mental defilements in that moment. So don't underestimate them or look down on them. These can be very useful things, ways of practice, and I would recommend you to try them out for yourself. So maybe for tonight I'll just give you these teachings, but after this, if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer them for you.